What's the highest elevation you've ever been? Do you even know? Maybe on top of a mountain, or it was probably on a plane. This is similar to being on top of Mount Everest, the only mountain in the world above 29,000 feet. Climbers today flock to its summit. Everest wasn't always like this. In the early 1900s, some wondered if it was even possible to reach the summit, and died trying to prove it was. Who were the individuals attempting the first ascent? And what sorts of hell did they go through to achieve it? This is the story of the first ascent of Mount Everest. In addition to making outdoor videos like this, Greenbelly also makes ready-to-eat adventure meals. Greenbelly meals are 650 calorie meal bars loaded with nutrition like protein, carbs, fats, sodium, and fiber. Greenbelly meals have been called Rice Krispie treats on steroids and come in 5 flavors using all natural ingredients. If you have an adventure trip coming up or just want a nutritionally robust meal for on the go, check us out at greenbelly.com. Mount Everest is located here, in the Himalayas, the highest mountain range in the world, split between Nepal on its southern side and China's Tibet on the northern side. In the early 1800s, Everest was just known as Peak 15.
Surprisingly, the world didn't know about the highest mountain until the middle of the 19th century. And it's only when those measurements were calculated that it was realized this mountain in eastern Nepal was most likely the highest mountain in the world.
It wasn't until 1856, after a huge survey of India, that Everest was determined to be the tallest mountain in the world. The name Everest came after the man who had initiated the survey, Sir George Everest. They later learned that Everest actually had native Tibetan and Nepalese names. This period in the mid and late 1800s was considered the golden age of alpinism, a time when many peaks saw their first ascents. The peaks in the Asian Himalayas were largely untouched and considered to be the last frontier of summits. For comparison, Mount Blanc, the highest mountain in the European Alps, is just shy of 16,000 feet. At over 29,000 feet, Everest is nearly twice the elevation. This raised the question if Everest was even climbable, and at what cost to find out.
It's the world's highest mountain, so inevitably it's going to attract interest. Was it possible to go there and climb it?
It wasn't until the 1920s, after World War I, that the possibilities opened up, and the British were particularly eager. Just a decade prior, the British had lost the race to the South Pole to the Norwegians, and lost the race to the North Pole to the Americans. They viewed Everest as a third pole and a new opportunity. By 1921, British officials considered summiting Everest a matter of national importance. Access to the mountain was not easy though.
The early expeditions to Everest were from the Tibetan side via Darjeeling. It certainly wasn't possible on the southern side because that was in the Kingdom of Nepal, which was closed to foreigners.
Since the southern side in Nepal was closed, climbers were forced to pursue it from the northern side in Tibet. Between 1921 and 1935, the British launched the first of a handful of unsuccessful expeditions to summit Everest. Several died in the process. Beyond the extremely dangerous terrain, one big issue was oxygen. The thin air made it difficult for individuals to survive.
People didn't know about altitude, certainly didn't know about altitude sickness, acute mountain sickness.
Most people start experiencing altitude sickness between 8,000 and 12,000 feet. Above 12,000 feet, the risk of high-altitude cerebral edema and pulmonary edema start increasing, causing fluid to build up in your head and lungs. Anything above 25,000 feet is considered the death zone, where the human body struggles to function almost entirely. And then World War II broke out.
All British expeditions ceased when the Second World War broke out, and then, of course, the political situation changed in Tibet with China taking it over.
After World War II and the Chinese Revolution in 1949, Tibet's borders were closed. Nepal, however, while still heavily restricted, became somewhat more open. This meant all of the British efforts on the northern Tibetan side had to be scrapped, and all efforts had to shift to exploring the southern Nepalese side. In 1951 and 1952, other countries started making attempts on the newly opened southern side as well. None were successful. The British gained permission from Nepal for an attempt in 1953. If they failed, the French and Swiss would have a chance after them in 1954 and 1955. The British knew that 1953 was their chance, and the pressure was on. Britain's Joint Himalayan Committee appointed British Colonel John Hunt to lead the high-stakes expedition. It was a massive undertaking. Hunt laid down a theoretical plan including everything from route planning to supplies. Their entire expedition team consisted of a whopping 400 people. Most were porters to carry supplies. Hunt ultimately decided on 10 climbers and 34 Sherpas. Only 6 would be used for actual attempts at the summit, known as assaults. Sherpas are an ethnic group native to Nepal and Tibet, who are observed to perform better at elevation. This observation was confirmed in 2010, when a super gene was found that helps them regulate oxygen more efficiently. 33-year-old Edmund Hillary made the team, an experienced mountaineer and beekeeper from New Zealand, part of the British Commonwealth. And Tenzing Norgay made the team, the most experienced Sherpa and a local from Nepal. The 1953 expedition would attempt Everest in May, before the Nepalese monsoon and avalanche season hit in June. Initial training took place in Snowdonia in Wales during the winter. Gear was primitive compared to modern standards. The men largely wore wool clothing, a string vest, down pants and jacket, and a layer of windbreakers, complete with leather boots and steel crampons, tied on their feet with string. They carried ladders, ropes, and long-handled ice axes made of wood and steel. They would sleep in small tents on upper slopes, inside of 9-pound sleeping bags. Portable radio technology was limited. Climbers were known to communicate their status with patterns made by their sleeping bags. Food included things like biscuits, rice, lentils, powdered milk, jam, and chicken. Oxygen tanks were basic, and could add 30 or 40 pounds to an individual's load. The earlier 1951 British expedition had surveyed a route via the new southern face, which Hunt wanted to pursue as well. They were to go through the Khumbu Icefall, up the western Khum, onto Mount Lhotse, and across the southern Col before the final assault. Most of the team arrived in Nepal by March of 1953. There were no roads from the capital in Kathmandu, so the entire crew hiked 175 miles to the small settlement of Ten Bosch. The team acclimatized for weeks. They eventually established a base camp at the bottom of Khumbu Glacier before starting their ascent at Khumbu Icefall.
On any other mountain, pretty well, if you had to approach the mountain through such a feature as a Khumbu Icefall, you probably wouldn't do it because it's very dangerous. It's riddled with crevasses, and in between the crevasses are these towers of ice that collapse at random.
This one's a bit loose.
The men also risked avalanches and snow bridges, a patch of snow that deceptively covers a crevasse. Climbers often stayed roped together. In the event one fell through, hopefully the other could anchor themselves in time. The expedition crossed the massive Bergschrund crevasse using a ladder, and arrived at the entrance of the western Khum. Then up the south face of Lhotse, a steep wall of blue glacial ice. Here steps needed to be cut, and climbers risked being hit by falling rocks. Then they reached the South Col, a saddle between two of the tallest mountains on Earth, Everest and Lhotse. Climbers were days away from any help if needed at this point. Maintaining composure was critical. Hunt had prepared for 3 assaults of 2 climbers each. After the first pair failed, it was Hillary and Norgay's turn. Despite being sleep deprived and low on oxygen, they left their final camp at 6:30 a.m. Traversing the Knifed Ridge, a steep section dropping for thousands of feet on either side, and up a steep rock face now known as Hillary's Step. At 11:30 a.m. on May 29, 1953, the pair reached the summit, becoming the first humans to set foot on top of the highly coveted Mount Everest, the highest point on Earth. They stayed for a few minutes for photographs before heading back down. News of the summit broke around the world. What was once thought to be unachievable had been achieved. Hillary and Hunt were knighted for their efforts, and the government of Nepal presented Norgay with 10,000 rupees. The route from the 1953 expedition is still the main route used by climbers today. And despite claiming the lives of over 300 people to date, Mount Everest attracts more climbers than it can handle.
These are images from high up on Everest, the path to the peak clogged with climbers.
Maybe to blame for at least 9 deaths.
Equipment has changed enormously, of course, in the years since Everest was first climbed. It's warmer and lighter.
And the route itself has become safer.
It has been made easier in recent years by commercial expeditions, which basically fix a line up the normal routes and have local people working very hard to carry supplies.
It's really becoming quite commercialized with these big operators bringing these lots of groups.
This commercialization has drawn a mound of criticism. There is now a road to and a hotel at base camp.
The mountains have been littered with plastic bottles.
Nepal has announced that the permit alone will cost $15,000 in 2025. Many have reported spending over $100,000 to get to the summit, further detracting from its appeal as a frontier adventure to an experience only reserved for the ultra-wealthy. Mount Everest still captures our fascination today as much as it did over 100 years ago. And those early expeditions remind us how determined the human spirit can be, challenging and reminding us what else is out there for us to strive for. A big thanks to the legendary Tim Macartney-Snape and Dan Mazur for their help making this video.
Wait a sec, hang on a sec. I didn't know this was like a real interview for TV and stuff. You could go put on a suit.
We are a small team that loves the outdoors and spend a lot of time creating these videos. If you like this and want to see more videos from us, we'd love your support by subscribing to Greenbelly's channel.